In this video I'll be showing you how we use blocks. Blocks are used as a starting point to create your own garment designs. We trace them off, alter them and then add the seam allowance. So you start by getting a piece of pattern paper that's large enough to fit all the blocks you'll be using for the design, and then trace around the outside. Then once you've done that, you'll mark the notches. So I'm marking the bust dart and the centre front and the button placket. And the double dart on the front as well. Then when that's done, use your set square to draw in the darts. I'm not making any alterations to this pattern, so I can just carry on and add my seam allowance. As blocks are made from cardboard and they're used over and over again, sometimes the edge of the corners just end up being slightly rounded, but what we want to have is nice crisp corners so that our pattern's accurate. So once you've traced your block out, just go through, and anything just like this, it's only a tiny amount, but it's easier to start with a 90-degree angle at the corners so that your pattern's accurate. So I've added 1 centimetre seam allowance on the shoulder, and I'm going to carry on adding 1 centimetre around the neckline. So you can see I'm using the 1 centimetre line on my set square and just slowly turning it around so that I'm getting the same seam allowance around the entire neckline. And again, I'm holding the 1 centimetre line of my set square onto the outer edge of the shirt, and then I can add that seam allowance there. For the bottom, I'm adding 2 centimetres for the hem so that I'll be able to turn it up twice, and then 1 centimetre along the side seam as well. So once your seam allowance is added, you want to transfer your notches over to the seam line. So if you've got a 1 centimetre seam, you want your notches to be about 5 millimetres. So making sure that my set square is being held at a right angle to the seam allowance, I'm transferring the notches over. And then whenever you finish the pattern, put all the information that you're going to need onto it. So on here I'm writing shirt front, cut to. You may want to add your name, the date, anything that's going to help you remember what that pattern piece was when you come to use it in the future. The next section I'm going to do is the sleeve block. So this sleeve is 57.5 centimetres long, and the usual length of an arm is 64 centimetres. So we need to take into account that we need the cuff to be at least 6.5, or you could extend the sleeve to be the entire 64 centimetres. So I've marked around the whole block. There's 2 notches on the back and 1 notch on the front of the sleeve. And then adding on the 1 centimetre seam allowance again. And I'm only adding on 1 centimetre to the edge of the sleeve, as it's not a hem allowance, that's where I'm going to sew the cuff onto it later. And transfer the notches over, and that marking there is for the placket. So that's the opening in the shirt sleeve that we'll cut into. This is the back of the shirt. So we're transferring all the notches over. That large hole there, that's for where we hang the pattern hook, so you don't need to mark that one onto your pattern. So right, centre back there and fold. If we were cutting out the whole shirt, we'd fold the fabric in half and place it along that line. So again, just making sure that there's nice sharp corners on the shoulder there. And so where the two pieces join, you want to make sure that's a 90 degrees, that you don't get a point where the shoulder seam is. So it's 1 centimetre around the armhole, around the side seam, and 2 centimetres on the hem. And then I'm not adding any seam allowance on the centre back. And then when that's all done, you can carefully cut out your pattern. Grain lines are usually marked onto the blocks that you're using. On the sleeve, it's that line that's running down the centre there. So you'd mark that in using a ruler, and you line this up so that your pattern would be facing in the direction that you intended it to. So we indicate that with a line with an arrow pointing which way the pattern's going to go. So even with a multi-directional pattern like this, there is still a straight grain of the fabric. And the grain of the fabric runs parallel to the selvage edge. So on the shirt front, it's the centre front line. And on the shirt back, it's the back line, it's the grain line. But if you forget which one's which, if there's lots of lines, then just write grain line onto whichever one you're using. To cut your pattern out, put down your calico. If you were cutting out 2 sleeves, you'd have 2 pieces of calico here. And then just make sure your grain line is running in the direction of the grain of the fabric that you're using. You don't need to use loads of pins, so 1 in each corner to start with. And then just add an extra one where needed. Then you can carefully cut out your pattern piece. And the sharper your scissors are, the easier this will be. The next step will be to transfer over all the other information that's on your pattern piece. So cut your notches in. A small pair of embroidery scissors is useful here. So remember, only cut halfway through the seam allowance. And then to transfer the dart markings over, if you put a pin through each point of the dart, and then unpin the pattern piece. And then I'm using a friction pen here, so you could use one of those, which is heat erasable, or you could use some chalk. Then take out all the pins you've used to mark. And you can either just use those as your indicators, or you can mark them in. Whenever you're using a friction pen or even a piece of chalk, make sure you test a piece of the fabric to make sure that the lines will disappear after you've sewn it. And then your fabric's prepared, ready to be sewn.